we've become very uncomfortable with absorbing and discussing and acknowledging reality if that reality contradicts our politics, our religious beliefs, the tribe that we belong to, or our worldview. And I think this is one of the reasons why people really struggle to think clearly. I have done so many videos on, the dynamics between men and women in relationships, on what it's like to be around a man in a state of arousal. I've talked about penetration not being neutral. There are so many topics that I've covered, and overwhelmingly in the comments, it's evident that people are usually far more committed and loyal to their ideological worldview than they are the lived reality. And what I really want to make clear here in today's video is that the invisible contracts framework and this work in general starts in the gap between what we are promised and told and the lived reality. And as far as I'm concerned, whatever worldview you have, wherever you're coming from, if there is a gap between those two things and millions of women are expressing and sharing a lived reality that is in contrast to whatever the system of power you subscribe to promises is the reward and or the result or the outcome, then that is worthy of analysis, first of all. But actually, we shouldn't be just sitting here pretending that it's not indeed true. And one of the kind of biggest criticisms I've received since really sharing these ideas online publicly is that, one, I'm a man hater, I'm anti-men, that I'm a misandrist, that I am a femcel. And on the other hand, of course, I can be criticized quite often for expressing views or sharing lived reality and data that comes from people's lived reality that may not align with feminist thinking. And what I want you to understand is that, first of all, I have never necessarily describe myself as a feminist. So I grew up in a religion whereby you have to remain politically neutral. I've never voted. And so these political labels, these ideological labels are not ones that I ever used to describe myself. But of course, since coming online and meeting people and people consuming my content, interacting with me, joining the community, I have no issue with the fact that often people might refer to me as a feminist. In fact, one of my videos was kind of, what do they call it, stitched, and it was taken and the label was radical feminist, which I found quite funny because actually there's a lot of feminist thinking and ideology that I do not align with. I'm very much somebody who believes in human rights. Dignity is one of my core top 3 values in terms of the way I operate in my life and the way I treat other people. Okay, but ironically, I don't necessarily align or agree with all types of feminism. And so it's very important because what can often happen when you are doing this kind of personal work is that you can often defer to tribalism, defer to ideological rigidity, even though the evidence, the lived experience that you're having in your life, number one, or the lived experience of millions of other people is in complete contrast to what that ideology promises will be the result if you stick to that ideology. Okay, so when we talk about invisible contracts, okay, this is a framework that treats lived reality as primary evidence. Yeah? That's why I always talk about, well, what are we being promised? What are we being sold versus what are we actually experiencing as women? That's where the invisible contracts actually operate. And so I make no apologies that lived reality is actually primary data that we do not question. Okay, it's just a nonsense. When I hear sometimes misogynistic people and specifically misogynistic men deny that femicide, for example, is real. We have a real problem in general with an inability for people to understand the difference between horizontal systemic analysis and vertical interpersonal experience. We do. And often people will be literally looking at their own ex-girlfriend, their own ex-wife, their daughter, their sister as evidence. That's not a large enough sample group to deny femicide, for example, to deny, assault, the prevalence of assault, to deny that we live in a culture that rape culture is dominant and prevails. Okay, it's so important, and I make no apologies, because the work really is about lived reality and lived experience being legitimate data. Okay, now here's how people usually think and work. So you're often taught by systems of power and, whatever ideological view you're coming from, here is what ought to be true. You see this all the time with religion. This ought to be true. This is the way things must be done. And therefore, this is what must be happening. And in real life, that's not how it works. Experiences, unfortunately, that contradict these are deemed to be exceptions, misunderstandings, anomalies, or failures of implementation. Religion is one of the biggest culprits of this. And we see this when it comes to invisible contracts and, for example, women and sex, right? A lot of religion and culture teaches women that if you abstain from sex, well, there's two areas. I mean, there's so many we could bring up. One is modesty. I've talked about that before. You're told that if you remain modest, you will be protected. You will not experience harm or abuse. Men will respect you. You will be chosen by a man, and you will be honored, respected, and cherished. If you abstain from sex before marriage, you will be chosen by a good man. He will see you as valuable, as pure, as high value as marriage material. You will be cherished, honored, and respected. Now, what do we see in reality? There is no direct correlation between virginity and modesty and being cherished, honored, and respected. There's no guarantees at all. And I can tell you that coming from a religion where that is the norm. But there are still dysfunctional marriages. There are still women who are being mistreated by their husbands. Their virginity did not insulate or immunize them from an unhealthy marriage. And on top of that, okay, you're told that sex is a gift within marriage only. But there's so many women, and I say so many, it's not even the right wording. There have been studies done, particularly on Christian evangelical women. They're not having any orgasms. You see, women have been gaslit into thinking that it's the connection that matters. The closeness that will do it, even though their husband is having orgasms every single time. They're not. They're rarely experiencing pleasure, deep sensory pleasure during the sex. But they have been told that stay pure, stay chaste, stay virginal until marriage for this gift. It's not giving, though. Invisible contracts. And what happens is, for many years, before we had social media, before studies were being done where these women were being asked what? About their lived experience, about their actual experiences, and they were being taken seriously. Any woman that may have said, if at all, I don't enjoy this, this isn't good for me, they would be deemed to be an exception. It's a misunderstanding. And by the way, that is still an idea that's floating around. I find it hilarious. I was watching a Nigerian podcast recently, and they were talking about sex and women and marriages and relationships. And the host kept saying, well, this is a cultural issue, he said. It's not going to be changed overnight. And they were talking about the fact that so many women are not having any orgasms and not experiencing pleasure during sex with men. So, it's this idea that women must wait another 30 years and in the meantime, allow their body to be used like a ping pong machine. No. You see, but because we now have social media, because now there are people who are investing in researching women's actual lived experiences, especially the women who followed all the rules, They obeyed these invisible contracts. Well, is the reward real? Is the reward true? Is the question. And then, of course, it's all a misunderstanding. Men just aren't educated enough. It's a cultural issue. Right? The same men who are leaders, apparently natural born leaders, they can't lead their way to the one part of the female anatomy that seems to have been designed exclusively for pleasure. You're not looking for the Garden of Eden, right? It's there. It's right there. But it's all a misunderstanding. It's a cultural issue that women need to be patient and understanding, and now we need to be collaborative and do the teamwork. Yeah? Or it's a failure of implementation. They will tell you that you're just not doing it right as a wife. You know what I mean? You need to speak up for yourself. You need to be the one to communicate. Right? It's all teamwork. Whereas when we talk about male satisfaction and pleasure, it's not always teamwork. Really, what the woman is required to be is sexually available. Yeah, she's not meant to withhold access to her body. But isn't it funny that even within that, her pleasure is not primary. Her pleasure is not a priority, because we have millions of women who are living in relationships where they're not experiencing any pleasure, just pressure, and rarely, infrequently having orgasms. And that is deemed to be acceptable. It's only because now we talk about these things far more openly that probably men are being exposed far more often to how women really think and feel about these things. And then also we have a generation of women who are deciding to opt out altogether, or actually do have a standard of pleasure and are choosing accordingly. They are choosing partners according to whether or not they're experiencing pleasure when they're with that partner. You see, and people they feel confronted, I suppose. I see a lot of comments coming up saying, do you know what, this needed to be said, but didn't feel great to hear it. My nervous system doesn't like it. I get so many DMs of that kind. When I first came across your content, I really didn't like you, but it was something that I needed to hear. Right? And so the way people usually think in terms of these ideological systems is, this is how it should be, therefore this is what is happening. And if you come along, especially as a woman, because we do not want to believe women quite often, and you say, actually, my experience is different, you then become the exception. You become the defect product. You're the one product that came down the conveyor belt, and there's just something wrong with you because everybody else is doing fine. Now, when we're doing this invisible contract work, it's the reverse, which is often what I find unsettles people when I do this work, because I focus on what is happening. So I've worked with corporate organizations now for 15 odd years. I've been self-employed for 10. And my work in selling cultural transformation, talent development, business transformation services to corporate organizations, 99% of the time, unless they have data, existing data that they can share with us, we go in and we gather data in real time. Because what I need to understand is what is happening, not what the organization, the kind of main point of contact stakeholder is telling me is happening. Because quite often they're not even close to the ground enough to really tell me what the root causes of the problems they have as an organization are. So this is why I go in and I will ask what is happening. And I actually ask the employees or the teams and departments that this intervention is going to be impacting. I want to know what the truth is, what the facts are. And then from there, we will, analyze the emerging patterns, especially repeated patterns. So do you see how this works? We start with what is actually happening in the lives of women. What patterns emerge repeatedly? What promises, assumptions, narratives, or invisible contracts are maintaining that reality? I'm going to read that again. What promises, assumptions, narratives are maintaining that reality? Because invisible contracts maintain the status quo. When you obey them and comply with them, the status quo gets stronger, in fact. And then what we then move on to is which of those contracts are useful, outdated, exploitative, or misaligned with reality. That's all this work really is about. Whether you do it on an individual level as a woman, or, as I say, when we take this kind of work into organizations. Because the workplace is a system of power. That is why we're able to look at it from the perspective of what invisible contracts are operating in this work environment, at leadership level, at managerial level, whatever level it is in an organization. But do you see how powerful it is? Yes, it could be more confronting, it can feel exposing, it can feel vulnerable, but how much more powerful it is when we focus on, or we start with what is happening as opposed to how things should be. Yeah, it's a completely different starting point. And this is one of the reasons why I used to have, especially I'd say maybe 2 months ago, I'd get quite a few comments underneath my videos, mostly over on TikTok. Or somebody would stitch my content and say, this girl is confusing. And they would give examples because they may have seen one video here and one video there. But the problem is understanding the fact that I am not ideologically rigid. I don't start from an ideological stance and then apply that to everything I investigate, analyze, or see or observe. I'm always starting from here. What is actually happening? What is the lived data, the lived experience? What is the reality? That's where we start. And so that means when you're always starting from a place of what is true, what is real, what is factual, what is actually happening, then of course the conclusions you reach will be aligned with what is actually happening. It's evidence-based, in other words. It's not ideological. It's not ideological in foundation. No, the foundation is what is actually happening. And this requires critical thinking skills. It requires some level of maturity, especially if you're doing this work on an individual basis. Because if you can't handle nuance, if you can't handle multiple things sometimes being true at once, this is going to be very difficult for you. But you have to remember, systems of power need you to only think through ideology, because then you're sleepwalking through your life, and then you're on a conveyor belt to only the direction, the sanctioned outcomes of that system of power. Because the minute you start really noticing and looking at what is actually happening, it might change the decisions that you make and how you see yourself. Yeah? And so the entry point is always describe your lived experience honestly. Yeah, not become the ideology. This is the problem that I see quite often, even when you think about some types of feminists, like reactionary feminism. I had talked about this. I'm going to be talking about it quite a bit. You've got certain feminists who, are saying actually young women should get married, they should have children early, because that will insulate them from the downsides of hookup culture and casual sex. Now, here's the thing. We're talking about two separate extremes here, number one. But number two, the invisible contracts, though, within marriage, there's no guarantee of well-being. There's no guarantee of health. Right? You're saying that these young women should refrain from sex altogether until marriage. That's fine, because that is not a wild belief, right? It's very common and quite a typical belief in many cultures and most religions. My point here is that those religions do not have anything to say about the quality of the sexual experience for the woman when she's in the marriage, though. Because again, what we see on the other side is that doesn't mean that you're enjoying the sex at all. right? And so this is why, in my view, and in this work around invisible contracts, we examine and analyze the lived experience first and honestly. Okay. Now, as I said, I grew up inside a system of power, a religion that required doctrinal coherence. Okay. And so you had to agree with the fundamental worldview that they were right in the first place, that God had ordained this group, small group of male, often white male human beings, okay, who were receiving direct guidance via Holy Spirit from God. You had to agree with that in the first place. Otherwise, the rest doesn't work, right? And so if you therefore believe that they have this special channel between them and God, and that they are Holy Spirit driven, and that they are the ones who lead the earthly organization, you then have to agree with everything that they mandate, sanction, and direct. So I know what this is like in terms of lived experience. And what happens is when people have experiences in those systems of power, what are they told? Usually it's a misunderstanding. Let's say the evidence is overwhelming that something egregious has happened. You will be convinced into thinking it's a misunderstanding and it's just human imperfection. Or you're an anomaly, you're an exception, you are the problem, or there's a failure of implementation. You aren't spiritual enough. You don't have strong enough faith. You're not favored. In fact, you are not favored. That's why it's not working for you in the way we keep promising that God said it would work for you. Right? So a lot of these ideological systems, these systems of power, they share very similar structures. There's accepted text, approved language, sanctioned interpretations, boundaries of acceptable disagreement, because that's a big one. Yeah, this is why you'll get so many, and I do find sometimes it's younger feminists, and I do think sometimes they just haven't lived enough life. I've seen a number of videos recently talking about the fact that if you shave your body hair in any way, you are doing it because of patriarchy. It cannot possibly be because of your own preference. And I chuckle with that because, you know, genetically, I have more body hair. And actually, there are some logistical and just practical hygiene reasons why I will remove certain body hair from my body. It's not because of patriarchy. I couldn't give two hecks what a man thinks. It's my own comfort. And what I'm saying here is what you find is when people become indoctrinated, often from a good place, the way people join religions, often from a good place, most people. Right? What happens is there's an accepted text, there's approved language, there's sanctioned interpretations, right? But you can't come outside of that, even if the lived reality of people is in contrast to the dominant, sanctioned, approved worldview. Yeah, the structure is often the same, whether it's feminism, it's the same structure every time. Now, I'm not saying that all of these ideologies are identical, equally weighted, equally harmful. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that it's a pattern of thinking that is trained and conditioned into people in general. And so when you're somebody who starts from the lived reality, they just think you're being the fly in the oil. You're an irritant. You're rebellious, you're overthinking, you're oversensitive, you talk too much. Yeah, ask me how I know, because that's what I've been told my entire life. Because I don't know, I find it very difficult when I see that the box is blue and everybody's telling me it's red. That doesn't work for me, because I'm going to start with the lived reality and respect that as legitimate data. And so it's very important when we often are talking about invisible contracts is that the question can't be which tribe does this idea belong to? This is why I get so many questions, especially of late, saying, what feminist literature are you reading? What are you reading? And the truth of the matter is that that's not the right place to start. Because this work starts with does this explain reality? After we know what the reality is, does this explain it? That is why it resonates with you. I'm not really sharing anything with you that you don't know in terms of your lived experience. I am merely articulating and naming and putting language to these experiences. The question should always be, does this explain reality? That video that I did around penetration not being neutral, my goodness, the comments crack me up. Because to this day, people who do not have vaginas, people who are not women with vaginas, are saying that this can't possibly be true. What do you mean? It's not your reality. And they are automatically saying this is just a feminist take. It's got nothing to do with feminism. Let's just be honest. Sex can be political, yes. But actually, when you get down to the nuts and bolts of it, the bread and butter of it, it is what it is. It's human nature. It's a desire. At its base level, it's desire. And you put people in the same space with that desire for one another or the thing, and what happens will happen. And all I did was talk about the practical reality of sex for women with vaginas, when the sex includes penetration. And my goodness, people have massive cognitive dissonance, and some people just outright cannot even bring themselves to accept that maybe, not even maybe, because if you look, there's equally thousands of comments from people of all genders, all sexual orientations, sharing their own experiences when it comes to penetration. I didn't just make this stuff up. There's enough lived reality. Okay? Enough lived reality. And you'd be surprised the number of people who are asexual, people who are celibate for various reasons. For various reasons. And in those comments, hundreds of people saying, this is why I don't have sex. And in return, people are just saying, oh, you're traumatized, you're hurt. You see? Because in reality, we find it very difficult to sit with people's actual experiences, especially when those experiences do not align with what we've ideologically been taught is true. Now, what I will say here is that acknowledging reality is not the same as endorsing reality. There are lots of things in life that happen and happen often, that are common, that are typical, that are also equally egregious, harmful crimes against humanity. So acknowledging reality is not the same as endorsing it. I shouldn't have to say that, but it seems like I do. Because obviously, look, my communication style, and this is what clients and organizations pay me for. I don't mince my words. And there are quite a few things in life, particularly when it pertains to women's lived experiences, that do require, quite frankly, a frank description. Yes, they do. Because part of the problem we have in this world is that we sanitize a lot of conversations to make people feel better. And what happens is you become completely numb and desensitized to the reality of obeying certain invisible contracts. And most women are numb. What happens is there's some kind of trigger event or life event that wakes a woman up, and then she realizes, I've been sleepwalking all this time. This doesn't align with me. This isn't dignifying. This is not edifying. It's usually a trigger event. But for the most part, we can be quite numb as women to these things. And the world, the systems of power need us to stay numb. Because when we wake up and realize, actually, no, this isn't right, it can be confronting for other people. And that includes other women too. When I have talked about things like sexual trauma, etc., the number of emails, DMs I get from women saying, I have never been able to talk about this before. You put words to things that I thought that I was going crazy about. Nobody in their life had the space or the bandwidth to hear them out. And the reality and the aftermath of it is not acknowledged. This is why I will never roll back from starting with what is the lived reality. And if that lived reality is in contradiction to ideology, too bad. Too bad. Too bad. All right? So as I say, sometimes we are looking at a reality And it is egregious, it's harmful, it's dysfunctional, it's toxic, all of the things. That does not mean you are endorsing it, right? It does not mean that you are endorsing it. But the important piece is that we do need to shine light on these things. And we should not be denying and dismissing women's real lived experience. It is data that should be taken seriously. And for too long, systems of power have gotten away with silencing women. And so if you are a person, regardless of your gender, and you find this uncomfortable, you need to sit with that. Why? The only way to get to a place of liberation is when you are prepared to honestly start with, what is the reality? What is the reality? And that often means that I am, generally speaking, an outlier in most spaces, because I'm not in the space because I agree ideologically with everyone in the room. And even if I go into a room, maybe with a particular viewpoint, that viewpoint will shift if evidence is presented that requires that viewpoint to be shifted. Absolutely. Because my priority, the foundation of this practice, of this field of thought, is that we start with, what is the lived reality? So I would really encourage you to subscribe, because obviously on this channel, what we talk about is invisible contracts, okay? The invisible contracts that govern women's lives, and how women can actually liberate themselves once they notice and identify these invisible contracts.